I want to thank Natasha and also Emily and Justin and Courtney and John and Colin for Or Books, which is an extraordinary left-wing publishing venture, and we have to sustain them and support them. However you can, please do. I want to start with just by saying that the book is a movement book, which is to say that it comes out of my experience of working in the debt resistance movement, which really sprang up in the early days of Occupy. And everyone in this panel, and many people I know in the audience, have been part of that movement. And George and Pam were there in the early days of Occupy Student Debt Campaign, and Sarah and Mike have all contributed really invaluable reporting and commentary and research. And of course, no one's responsible for the errors and the crimes of political passion that are in the book, except for myself. But each of them, in their own way, have contributed quite a bit to what appears in the pages of the book. Let me begin with some good news. What seems to be good news is that overall, household debt as a percentage of income has decreased quite a bit since the sky-high levels of 2008. And there's some debate about whether that decrease has been a result of low interest rates, or whether it's a result of the banks writing off a lot of non-performing loans. But regardless, that deleveraging downward seems to have stopped, and we're on the rise again. Third quarter of last year, mortgage debt jumped by $56 billion, and the Federal Reserve reports for the fourth quarter were just out today and show 1.9% rise in mortgage debt over that quarter, and non-housing household debt has gone up 3.9% over the course of that quarter. So clearly we're on the rise again. But regardless of what the numbers say, economists, including those who are critical of neoliberalism, seem to have decided that the so-called debt overhang from 2008 has now been resolved, and that it's safe to start borrowing again, and that indeed we must do so if we're going to get GDP-driven growth back on track again, back to business as usual. That's the consensus that's out there. I think this is bad analysis, and it's bad advice. The debt overhang is one of these dodgy concepts that economists use to rationalize an otherwise unsustainable situation. And as for GDP-driven growth, all the evidence suggests that that's a recipe for ecological collapse. So in the book, I propose that we live in the kind of society, I call it creditocracy, where everyone is, almost everyone is so deeply in debt that can never be paid off, nor is it supposed to be paid off. And this is an important thing to understand. Our creditors don't want us to pay down our debts entirely, for the same reason that credit card issuers don't want you to clear your bank balance at the end of the month. Right? If you do that, if you clear your bank balance at the end of the month, they call the term they have for you in the industry is deadbeat. You're deadbeats. They don't want deadbeats, they want revolvers, people who can't make ends meet, who pay the minimum every month, they pay the late fees, they pay the penalties, ensuring this steady stream of revenue to the banks for eternity without ever paying down the principal, really. So that's the goal, to make lifelong revolvers of us all. After all, if you pay off your debt, you're no longer serviceable to the banks. You're not a source of profit to them. And so they want us to be on the hook until the day we die, and in the case of parental co-signers of student debt, sometimes beyond the grave, which is one of the reasons why the debt burden is shifting disproportionately towards the elderly. It's one of the marked pronounced shifts. So creditocracy is a society where it's a little different from a rampant market civilization where every social good is transformed into commodity. Creditocracy emerges when the cost of access to these social goods has to be personally debt financed. So we're basically borrowing in order to meet the basic requirements of life, not to bring about material improvements in our life, but to meet the basic requirements of life. Now, if you do the math, you look at average household incomes which are stagnant or falling, and therefore it's automatically the case that people are going to have to take out fresh credit in order to service their existing loans, right? And this is a formula, taking out new loans in order to perform existing debt service. This is a formula that was first institutionalized by the IMF and developed for developing countries in the course of the aftermath of the debt trap of the 1960s and 1970s. Each new installment of an IMF loan is used to perform existing debt service. The principal is never paid down. But if you think about it, at least for the working poor, this is an arrangement that's been familiar for much, much, much longer. It really goes way back to its classic forms of debt bondage under slavery and feudalism and indenture. The successor institutions to these forms were sharecropping, company scrip, loan sharking, and the legacy of that is alive and well today on the subprime landscape of fringe finance, where you have the payday lenders and the check cashers and the other poverty banks thriving on that kind of a landscape. So what's different, however, I think it's fair to say, is that this condition of permanent indebtedness has moved upscale in the last few decades and has penetrated far into the middle class. And it's tethering at least 2 generations now of the college educated. So we have this lifelong burden now of debt service, or what the creditors would like us to think of it that way, and to behave that way. What is the impact on citizenship in that kind of society? This is one of the lines of inquiry that I pursue in the course of the book. What's the impact on democracy? How can a democracy survive when it's on the road to debt serfdom? And it's a very important question for all of us, I think, because all over the world now we're seeing failed democracies everywhere. We're seeing elected governments being forced to prioritize the rights of creditors to be made whole, and to prioritize these rights over and above the social needs of their citizenry. Everywhere we look, not just in the developing world anymore, but all across the Eurozone and in the Americas, elected officials are being asked to act as debt collection agents, basically, for foreign creditors and bondholders. And this is not just an economic arrangement, although if it was a policy that I would call no bondholder left behind. It's also a relationship with power, and it has a very damaging impact on popular sovereignty and popular democracy. So the historical record shows that societies that are in this condition, societies that are unable to check the power of their creditor class, very quickly see the onset of debt bondage, and often in the form of slavery. And so the question is, are we heading down that road again? Are we at that crossroads again? Or is a lot of the talk right now very loose talk? All this talk about student debt as a form of indenture, talk about the danger of the revival of debtors' prisons all across this country, talk about predatory banking practices as extreme forms of usury. We've also seen a revival of interest in debt jubilees. George and Pam and I were all members of Strike Debt when we launched the Rolling Jubilee. That is a tradition that's very evocative of the macro solutions that were hatched in the ancient world by rulers who were so desperate to restore the balance of power in their favor away from the creditor class that they decided to abolish all existing debts and set slaves free and restore land to its original owners. Following in that tradition, what we've seen in the last couple of decades is something called the Jubilee South movement, which many of you will be familiar with. Advocates for Jubilee South developed moral and legal arguments for canceling the external debts of a lot of developing countries and had some success in doing so. So in my book, I argue that we need to take some of these moral and legal arguments that were developed by that movement, customize them, adapt them, add on a few new ones, and apply them to household debts here in the North, especially those that are incurred to access vital social goods like education, healthcare, housing, public infrastructure. And basically, we've had 5 years. The government's had 5 years to provide debt relief, and for one reason or another, our governments have not been able to do so. So it is an act, it's a basic democratic right for the citizenry to take debt relief for itself by any means necessary, and mostly through forms of economic disobedience. So I'll finish soon. I just want to say a few final words about the challenge, the very difficult challenge of organizing around debt. It's different from organizing around wages. That ain't exactly easy either. But it's quite different. George has written about this, about debt. Everyone's debts are fairly unique. They're like fingerprints. We often don't know who we owe money to because our loans are being bought and sold so many times. It's very difficult to get people to recognize that they have a common interest in organizing to pursue some form of economic disobedience. But we do know that there's an appetite out there for a debtors movement. Challenge is organizing. It's difficult to imagine at this point what form that movement will take, what tactics it will adopt, what pathways it will pursue. But we do think, or I do think, and others do, I know others in this room believe, that without a debtors movement coming into being, popular democracy is something we can probably kiss goodbye to. The last thing I'll say is something I'm very fond of saying, that, and it's a very neat historical distinction, and it goes like this. In the industrial era, a major form of strife was over wages. And in our times, it looks as if the struggle over debt is shaping up to be the frontline conflict. Not because wage conflict is over and never will be, but because wages are quite literally, debts are quite literally the wages of the future, to which creditors lay claim far in advance. And so each new surrender of a part of our lives to private debt financing further consumes the fruit of a labor that we haven't yet performed in the future in the form of compensation that we haven't yet earned. And that's why I think of most of the debts we're talking about as a form of wage theft, kind of premature wage theft, and which is why I think that a debtors movement is really a natural extension of the labor movement and may require a level of organizing that was as momentous as the labor movement in its heyday. I'll leave it at that and pass the mic to Sarah.
He did that because he knew who he was handing the microphone to. You're setting me up.
I am.
So I write about labor, obviously.
Say your name again.
Sarah Jaffe. I like to start these panels off by saying I'm Sarah Jaffe. I am $15,000 in student debt, but I did just pay off my credit cards. So the credit card companies are now mad at me. I'm now officially a deadbeat.
You're a deadbeat.
I know.
Shame
Great.
on you.
Glorious. Feels great. I'm never going to pay off the student loans. That's another story. But yeah, being here on this panel with Andrew, with Pam, with Mike, I've not been on panels with you guys before, I don't think, but it's good to be here. It sort of feels like getting the band back together. We've been doing this for a while. I've been on countless panels with people on this panel right now, talking about debt, talking about student debt specifically, talking about debt more broadly. One of the things that has given me a lot of hope is that the last few panels I've done talking about debt, I don't have to convince anybody that this is a social problem anymore. I used to have to tell kids, you know, college students particularly, no, this isn't just you. This isn't just a thing that you did to take on your future that is unique to you. This is not just your problem. This is everybody's problem. Another thing I like to do with these panels is ask, how many people in this room have student debt? Raise your hands. How many people have credit card debt? I can now just put my hands down. How many people have a mortgage? Right, so it's a social problem. It's also New York, so fewer of us have mortgages, huh? And I don't have to convince people of that anymore, which feels great. Now I get people going, what are we doing? And that's where I wish I had answers. But I think that this book actually is very helpful for the people we still have to convince that this is a social problem. And I like this argument, particularly about debt as a labor issue, about a debtors movement being a labor movement, because I see people in labor often, or people who have a sort of labor outlook on things, telling me that I should stop talking about debt, it's a distraction, we just need to make sure wages are higher, and the debt problem will go away. And I don't think that's true. But I do think that it is useful to think about debt as a claim on future wages. I think it's useful to think about debt as premature wage theft, because wage theft is one of the best, most useful frameworks that the labor movement has come up with in recent years to talk about what it means when your boss doesn't pay you for overtime, or when your boss doesn't pay you for hours worked, or when you're a waiter and your boss steals your tips. That it's not just you're being underpaid or you're not being paid, it's that they are stealing something from you. And the idea that having debt that you will never pay off, having spent the last 11, 12 years of my life paying interest on student loans of which I have made no dent in the principal whatsoever, is wage theft, right? I haven't even done the math still because it depresses me. It's also true that as wages have stagnated and even gone down in this country, I looked up recently that the median household income has gone down about $5,000 a household since the financial crisis. Debt has, of course, gone up. Debt has become the way we finance things that we used to pay for with what we used to call your salary. And so this connection, this is a problem, right? This has also gone, the rise of debt has gone hand in hand with the decline of labor unions, right? The decline in membership of labor unions. And we won't talk about Volkswagen this week because I'm depressed. But as we are seeing movements in the lowest wage sectors of the economy, those are also the people who tend to be preyed upon by some of these very predatory low-end banking techniques, or not even banking, payday lenders. My favorite story recently was the payroll debit cards that a lot of companies are now using. So instead of getting a paycheck, you get a debit card and you have to pay a fee to withdraw your money if you don't have a bank account at this bank. Most of these are going to people who make very little money and so have very little access to traditional banking. And so this argument, or this issue in particular is one that I am very interested in, because the other part of this argument is people tell me, you know, debt is a middle class problem. Student debt is for kids who went to college. We don't need to worry about them because they'll make $1 million more over their lifetime than people who didn't go to college. Well, that's sort of not as true now as it used to be, and maybe Mike has more recent numbers on that than I do. But also, what kind of debt are we talking about when we're talking about the payday lender who's taking a big chunk out of your loan? So I'm going to throw something out there that's suddenly getting a lot of interest, and then pass this on to the next folks. We've suddenly been hearing people talking about postal banking, which is it in the book? Did you mention it in the book?
A little bit.
A little bit. Using the postal service as a bank, which would end up providing actual banking services, not from the finance industry, but from a government agency. People have talked about it as a sort of public option for the banking industry, and it would really work for the people who are being preyed on, especially by these sort of very predatory, low-end shadow banking hellholes. And on that one, so that's, you know, I'm trying to leave you with some hope. There are some things that are suddenly being talked about. People are saying that this is something that could be done without it even having to pass through Congress, which is good because nothing passes through Congress these days. And I'll pass this up through.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I wanted to speak about a very important facet of this book. This book does many things. One thing is that it gives you a history of debt and debt resistance. The other thing that it does very well is a political job that needs to be done in the development of a debtors movement. This is something that we began to notice very early on in our work around the student debt, as well as later on other forms of debt. We discovered, of course, that many were unable to speak about their debt because they were ashamed. They felt morally in the wrong if they thought about refusing their debt. And this was surprisingly widespread in our discussions. We discovered more and more that there was almost a kind of a primal anxiety when we spoke about refusal of debt as being something that was a violation of someone's morality. So one of the most important things that we put forward to as a political project was to speak directly to this, these anxieties, this sense of being immoral if one refuses one's debts. And in this book, Andrew does something very, as always, he's a very bold guy, and very important. Boldness is very important in our political work. And he put together a series of arguments that I wanted to have. First, I wanted to read them to you so that you have a sense of, if you have any moral qualms about refusing debt, let's see whether this bomb is effective on it. Loans which either benefit the creditor only or inflict social and environmental damage on individuals, families, and communities should be renegotiated to compensate for harms. The sale of loans to borrowers who cannot repay is unscrupulous, and so the collection of such debt should not be honored. The banks and their beneficiaries, awash in profit, have done very well. They have been paid enough already and do not need to be additionally reimbursed. The fourth argument, the credit is not theirs to begin with. Most of it was obtained through the dubious power of money creation, thanks to fractional reserve banking and the magic of derivatives. The right to claim unearned income from debts created so easily should not be recognized as binding. Even if household debts were not intentionally imposed as political constraints, they unavoidably stifle our capacity to think freely, act conscientiously, and fulfill our democratic responsibilities. Economic disobedience is justified as a protective deed on behalf of democracy. This is argument six. Extracting long-term profits from our short-term need to access subsistence resources or vital common goods like education, healthcare, and public infrastructure is usurious and should be outlawed. This is argument 7. Each act of debt service should be regarded as non-productive addition to the bank's balance sheets and a subtraction from the real economy that creates jobs, adequately funds social spending, and sustains the well-being of communities. This is 8. Obliging debtors to forfeit future income is a form of wage theft, and if the debts are incurred simply to prepare ourselves in mind and body for employment, they should be resisted. And the final argument, among many possible ones, and one that we might in fact construct this evening, the final one, given the fraud and deceit practiced by bankers and the likelihood that they will not refrain from such antisocial conduct in the future, it would be morally hazardous for us to reward them any further. Okay, these are the arguments that were presented, and I think that they're very important for us to think through. One of the things that I noticed in reading them is that I realized that there's been this long discourse that goes back thousands of years, a discourse that is directed against debt. The fear and anxiety of debt and the creation of a creditor class, of a dominant creditor class, has been around for many centuries. And arguments against basically a creditocracy have been developed in the ancient Mediterranean, in the Mesopotamian world. And these arguments, for example, the arguments against financial industries, against banking, go back thousands of years. One of the most important speakers in the history of thought concerning the refusal of debt and the refusal of usury is one of the important philosophers of the ancient Greek world, Aristotle. In book 1 of his Politics, he basically says, making money from money is unnatural. And in fact, we have very similar arguments here, right? And it's not surprising, because these anxieties that we have about the power of credit to take over societies has been around for quite some time. It's a little bit like, for the ancient world, the development of credit and money lending sectors of the economy was something like a nuclear power that could explode and destroy whole societies, as these pressures that led to debt enslavement did lead to revolutions and breakdowns of whole social systems. So there's a huge background in these arguments that Andrew has put together in this book. And basically, the whole picture that he paints of the debt contract, you might say, is that the debt contract is fundamentally immoral. And so those who feel like debt refusal is an immoral act must realize that the debt contract is immoral in and of itself. And so therefore, instead of feeling immoral, one should feel like it's perfectly right to reject an immoral contract, an immoral offer. And well, why is it immoral? It's immortal, yes. Up to now, it's had this immortal character. But why is it immoral? First and foremost, because it presents itself as being a pact between two free beings. It's a little bit like the fraud that goes on in the labor contract. And in fact, on reading Andrew's list of arguments, it reminded me of the arguments that Marx makes in Capital against the wage contract, where he shows that the wage contract is fundamentally presents itself as a contract between equals, and in fact, it's far from that. The worker and the capitalist are far from equal, and what in fact is negotiated between the two is not what it's claimed to be negotiated, but in fact is there's a hidden agenda in the wage contract, because the capitalist buys the labor power of the worker and makes a profit out of it. whereas the capitalist appears not to buy the labor power of the worker, but buys the worker's time for the working day. And that hides, fundamentally, in the labor contract, it hides that fundamental exploitation that's going on. Now, in a way, Andrew presents the debt contract in ways very similar to the way Marx presented the labor contract or the wage contract. And just for a minute, I parallel Andrew's efforts with Marx's work in his attack on the wage system and the wage contract. Because Marx says the wage contract appears to be a compact between that has the virtues of freedom, equality, property, and what he calls benefit, which basically means that it's good for the whole society. And let's look at the debt contract using Andrew's arguments. It says freedom. Is it actually, are the two parties that come together in our society, the creditor and the debtor, are they equal in terms of power and in terms of the freedom to negotiate? It's one of the things that Andrew and others in the anti-debt movement are saying is that we have a new situation that we're facing, where debt has now become an essential part of the way in which we satisfy the basic requirements of life. So that, in fact, the debtor is not free, does not have the status of a free agent that enters into. You might reject one creditor for another, maybe that's your freedom, but that you will have to enter into the debt contract is, at this point in history, unless there's a fundamental change, your fate. So also the notion that there's a fundamental equality that goes on in terms of what the exchange is also very untrue. It's, in a fundamental sense, what the creditor does, the banker does, when they open up the debt relation. I'll be finishing the debt. The debt relation is that, in fact, in this type of banking system, he actually, or the banker actually creates money in the process of making their part of the debt contract. And in the exchange, the debtor puts on the counter something which in itself is not a commodity at all. It's something that is in the future, and it is your labor power, part of yourself, somewhere in the future. So we have on the one side a banker who, in fact, creates money in the process of making their part of the labor contract, and on the other side we have somebody negotiating a contract which actually puts on the table something totally abstract. It's quite a strange connection that is being made here. In fact, as Karl Polanyi said many decades ago, these are fictitious commodities. The money and the labor that is being put together in the debt contract. I would then like to say, is this contract following the principles of the utilitarians, the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, when we look at, in fact, the societies that are dominated by a creditor class, we see, in fact, a society that is led to increasing inequalities and increasing tensions that, when we take the long view of history, we see that it leads to tremendous breakdowns. So I think for the therapy that's necessary in order to start the first processes of debt refusal, Andrew's book does a very important job, and so I applaud him.
Okay, I'm going to totally switch gears. There's going to be a little bit of dissonance here, different tone. But it's good, we're mixing it up. The same book is eliciting very different responses. So it's good. So my name is Sarah Ludwig, and I work in an organization called New Economy Project, which is based in New York City. And New Economy Project, which we do not call NEP. Those of you who know your Soviet history laughed. Those of you who didn't had no idea what I was talking about. So New Economy Project was founded in 1995. We've been around for getting on towards 20 years. And we work with community groups in New York City that are organizing to build a new economy. So a new economy that's based on principles of cooperation, of ecological sustainability, of racial and economic justice, of mutuality, inclusion, equity. Need I go on? You get the idea. And, excuse me, we think it's really important in doing our work to help people envision and think about a new economy to have a good sense of narrative of how we got to where we are and why things look the way they do, so that the language, the story, the way we're talking about it, if we're going to be working together, has a consistency. And there's so many things that are out there, and there's so much sort of mythology about, you know, how we got to where we are and who's at fault, and people, the shame that has already come up, and people's sense of, you know, what did I do that was wrong or irresponsible or reckless. That just sort of transcend that and get to people to understand that there's systemic, structural forces and causes and actions and so forth that have led us to have neighborhoods the way they look and people in the situations they are is really key. And so I'm really excited. I was saying to Andrew when I first got here that everyone on our staff, and there's one staff member here, Luis, you'll be reading this book. It's very, no, he will like it. He definitely will like it. In fact, there's somebody else on staff who already read it. So there's 2 of us, 10 to go. But I think it's really helpful for offering the kind of frame that one is always looking for to understand and kind of have language and a context. And so, you know, thank you. It's really helpful, and we'll definitely be extracting from it in our work and when we work with community groups. But when I was reading this book, it made me think about the work we've been doing for the last 20 years with community groups. And there are a couple of things that it just, you know, kind of pulled me through. One is definitely the challenges of organizing around debt. You know, it's not some monolith of debt. You talked about different types of debt. You know, there's sort of the debt that's incurred because the public function has completely broken down and we don't have a sense of the common weal and the right to education and housing and medical care and all of that. The people are in massive, massive amounts of debt for that. But we work with people, we have a hotline and also do a lot of work in communities with organizations and their members that come to us with unbelievable amounts of debt just to buy diapers and food, and you know, that's kind of how they get by. And it is a lot of seniors. That's a huge segment of people who end up coming to us. And so I was also thinking in reading the book about some of the contradictions in our work that arise from how we approach it. So we're working with community organizations, and they have members and constituents in neighborhoods. And what's clear to us from doing this work over the last couple of decades is that it's not just about wage theft, which is bad enough, right? It's not just about kind of your future earnings being paid through the debt or laid claim to through the debts, but there's also this siphoning out of entire neighborhoods disproportionate amounts of, I think people call it wealth or assets. What's a better language? Capital, money. Some of it's real, most of it's real cash I'm talking about. Not talking about the more illusory derivative type of, I can't really see it, but it's there and people are getting super, super rich off of this and it's itself extractive. I'm talking about like real, just hard cash coming out of communities, you know, that are communities of color at all, you know, at all income levels in our city. So there's a real manifestation of everything that's talked about in the book that plays out geographically, that plays out in space, that serves not just to impoverish people and keep them impoverished, but to ensure that we have continued segregation and deterioration of communities and that, you know, that itself becomes self-perpetuating, and it's really profound. And so the idea of kind of organizing around debt when people are suffering really profoundly, and I mean, I thought it is a challenge. It's not just the shame, it's also the day-to-day struggle of life. And also seeing the commonality with other people going through this and understanding that it's structural is something that's been very hard for us to help people understand. But people, you know, some people get it, some people are so just kind of bought into the, you know, dominant paradigm, if you will, about, you know, what it is to kind of be a responsible person. That means you become a homeowner, and if you're being responsible to your family, it means you're, you know, it's sort of like this notion of, I think you said this in here, I hope I'm not making it up, that there's a kind of like first-class citizenship that's defined by your indebtedness, you know? That there's, I mean, ironically, that it's become, right? So that, you know, for lots of people, that's the definition, and the sort of, you know, kind of mandate to consume that's all around us gets entwined in that too. So, I forgot exactly where I was going at. It was like a compound train of thought there. Except that a lot of the groups that we work with, again, oh yeah, so they're sort of working with people who are really struggling, and we ended up organizationally, even though our mission from the get-go was to help community groups not just fight against discriminatory economic practices, not just to fight for economic justice, but also to build locally controlled economic institutions that were democratically structured and that were, you know, very much about you know, cooperative finance and worker co-ops, and we can talk about some of these models, community land trusts and stuff, that are really important for community control. We very quickly, even though that was our stated mission and we set out to do that work in the 90s, just got pulled onto a track of working with groups to deal with the foreclosures that were sweeping through communities of color starting in the mid-1990s. You could have done like, remember those paint by number things?
Yeah.
You know, or like in The Omen when he's like got the photographs and he's like, remember, you know, developing the pictures and like out comes this scary, horrible thing. I mean, we started mapping where these foreclosures were, and then also where the consumer finance companies were doing their lending, starting in the 1990s, and the patterns and the connection between these destructive types of lending and the resultant foreclosures that were sweeping through neighborhoods was so connected to race. Again, at all income levels, some of the wealthier communities of Southeast Queens that are predominantly black have been devastated by all of this. And it was very quick in the process. It didn't take long, although it felt long at the time, but if you look back, it was very quick. The banks figured out there was so much money to be made through this same flooding of communities of color with this destabilizing credit and the securitization and the whole Wall Street apparatus that emerged or was constructed around it, that they got in on the game and they bought these companies. And now it's all one and the same. So when you talk about those low life, what do you call them?
Oh, I have lots of terrible words.
No, but what was it? It was good straight
payday
put
loans?
together. The payday lenders, they're like low life, what were they?
Shadow, yeah,
No,
I
you had
rattled off all the, I don't know.
Those
Fringe
bad.
I'd never be able to say it the
What
same
was
way.
Loan
Fringe
sharks.
finance? Alternative financial services in the industry.
Oh, whatever.
No. When you talk about those like fringe, low life, you know, slug payday lenders, they're the banks. I mean, they're really connected with the banks. Either the banks are fueling them by capitalizing them, the banks own them, maybe they have a different name, but it's in the same holding company. That the banks have created the circumstances in which, you know, through their redlining and other discriminatory practices have created the conditions in which these lenders can flourish. Anyway, so I was thinking about all of this as I was reading the book, and then just kind of how we got pulled into these skirmishes where we, through our work with community groups, were wanting to be responsive to what was happening in neighborhoods, but that led us to a less than structural response. It led us into a lot of skirmishes, a lot of battles. Good battles, noble battles, but battles that were kind of like on quicksand, right? So like how, you know, we, for years, went around to all the federal regulators, and they would meet with us, sure, we'll meet with you. And we would come in with, you know, all sorts of lawyerly arguments and people from communities who were experiencing things firsthand, who could talk directly about what was happening to them and their neighbors in their neighborhoods. And again, I thought of this reading the book, where the, you know, Federal Reserve, the Bank of New York, we went in the, you know, late 90s and talked all about these companies that were running roughshod over communities of color in the city, and they said things like, oh, that is only anecdotal. Do you have any evidence? So we pulled out our maps. We thought, okay, well, look, here's this graphic representation based on publicly available data. We've got people telling you this is happening. How can the same thing be happening to thousands of people and it each be their individual fault? You know, I thought that was a pretty good argument. But the point is, they say, this makes no economic sense. Lenders wouldn't make loans to people that they couldn't afford to repay. Go away. Then we got into like the point where by the early 2000s, they couldn't really ignore it anymore. Although, you know, if you look at a lot of media coverage of the financial crisis, you'd think it all started in like 2006. But, you know, the seeds of it were planted a long time ago and so forth. But when they finally couldn't ignore it, the thing that we got told over and over again is we're creating a task force to investigate. So there were a lot of task forces that did nothing. So anyway, we've gotten really caught up in some of these skirmishes, but through that you also learn a lot. You get to see, we've been able to see up front what's happening. And there's a kind of question that I have thinking about a movement of, you know, debtors resistance or debt refusal, about kind of, you know, there's the hypothetical, the theoretical, the abstract, which all makes total sense to me. And then there's the sort of where's your point of entry and where do you get traction and how do you translate this into real life. And the people we work with, who tend not to be so much students, that's not our constituency, you know, don't see themselves, again, as necessarily organized, but also, you know, do you sort of fight for changes that, I mean, this is like age-old stories. You've all, I imagine many of you have contended with this, right? It's kind of, does it make any sense to be doing things incrementally or not? Do you just go for the jugular, or do you try to help alleviate some of the suffering that's happening right now in people's lives, in neighborhoods where they live, as they live and breathe, and try to eat, and try not to, you know, get kicked out of their homes and so forth, and deal with the just relentless string of, you know, debt collection calls all day long and the emotional and physical and other stresses that come with all of that.
Oh, and the banks and the debt collectors too.
They do. Well, kind of. Yeah.
Some.
So all I want to say about that is that, you know, so over the years we've done things like get laws passed that make it, so you ready for this? Banks can't freeze your bank account when they get a judgment against you if all the money in your bank account is exempt from collection. It's legally protected because all of your income is made up of Social Security. All of your income is made up of SSI or other public benefits, which actually, by law, creditors can't take. But we were getting just endless calls from people who were finding that they couldn't buy medicine, they couldn't pay the rent, they couldn't eat, let alone pay their debts, because their bank accounts had been frozen illegally. And so we got laws passed that you have to let people have enough money so they can breathe, right? You can't seize that. So what do you do about that? Like, I mean, is that a worthwhile thing? Maybe in the discussion later we can talk about some of these things, that if you see these problems that are affecting tons of people, what do you do? Do you kind of figure out a cure? And the last thing I want to tell you about is this debt collection lawsuit that we brought. So we got, I don't know, Luis was like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, a lot of phone calls from low-income New Yorkers who were finding out that they had been sued by companies that had purchased debt after the lawsuit had been started and finished. They found out that when they got, let's say, a credit report and there was a judgment against them, it's like, wait a second, how can there be this court judgment against me over some credit that I might or might not recognize? I was never told that I was being sued. So what's like basic kind of constitutional right when you're being sued?
Be told that you're being sued.
You have to get notice if you're being sued. It's called due process. So what we were seeing was this really profound systemic problem, which debt buyers, companies that are buying up just gobs and gobs of debt, it's their whole business model is they buy up gigantic amounts of debt really cheaply, and then maybe they sell it to another debt buyer, so it changes many hands, and those of you involved with strike debt know this stuff really well. That they were basically, as a business model, en masse suing New Yorkers, and we've mapped this. It's almost all people living in very low-income neighborhoods. It's almost all people living in communities of color who are getting sued while the debt buyers are extracting hundreds of millions of dollars in often disputed old debt and not telling people that they've even sued them, so they don't have a right even to go to court and say, I don't know what that is. The research that we've done has shown that in the last, we did 2 sets of research, one with a bunch of groups and one just us, but over the last many years, 1% of people even had legal representation in these cases. We're talking about tens of thousands of lawsuits. In another time period, it was, I think, less than 2%. So there's a really fundamental problem there and an economic justice issue there. And we brought a class action lawsuit against a ring of debt buyers, the largest debt buying company in the country, the largest debt buyer law firm in the country, and we charged them with conspiracy to commit fraud. We charged them with civil RICO. And we brought this lawsuit in federal court, and we got it certified as a class action. 120,000 people in New York City, we believe that they are virtually all low income, are in this class, in this lawsuit. So what do these largest debt buying company and the largest debt buying lawyer, they might have slipped one of them into number 2, but you get the idea. What did they do? They went out and hired really expensive fancy lawyers. They lawyered up. And they've appealed our class action certification to the Second Circuit in New York, the appeals court. And they are saying that there's not really a class here. But think about this. I'll give you, you'll appreciate this. One of the lawyers is Miguel Estrada. Does that name mean anything to anybody? Who's he? He's like this, what my colleague said, he's a very well-known right-wing litigator. So that's what we can identify him. And the other person is, I think his name's Paul Clement, the Solicitor General under Bush. What was his first name?
That's right.
Paul Clement. Okay. So that's who they've hired because these are giant companies, and the big debt buyer is actually part of a really giant extractive mining company, this whole bank holding company with a debt buying arm. I already said it's like one of the largest in the country. It's a tiny little percentage of their corporate profile. But they are like, this would just get the entire business model to crumble if we were to prevail on this. And they know it, and there's just zillions and zillions of dollars at stake. So can we talk about that? It would be good to know, like, do you do stuff like this? Is this debt refusal? Trying to, like, get it? I don't know. Why not? Okay. Okay, it is now. George got to read to you, so I'm going to read to you one quick thing. This is a really important question. It's on page 100. What lies beyond immediate debt relief? The hard task of building a successor economy around the principles of socially productive credit, as opposed to one run on predatory debt. And so I also posed to the group, what does it mean to have principled finance? We can say, okay, finance should serve the real economy. That sounds good, I believe that. But what does it really, really look like? We're trying to build a new economy, not just in New York, but everywhere, that's based on, as I said before, economic democracy and other really important principles. What does principled finance look like? And I'll leave you with that question.
Well, thank you. Guess I want to start by saying that, you know, it's exciting being here tonight in sort of a strange way, because it does feel like the band, in a way, is like back together. But I remember how this all started. And I think that maybe Andrew and also George have not maybe been, I don't know, been received or given themselves the credit that's due, because if I recall correctly, I'm not sure if it was an open forum, and I know that people from open forum are actually here tonight, but there was a talk that Andrew gave in the first days of Occupy at 60 Wall Street, and George, you did one also, if I recall, and I can't remember what yours was on, but I remember that Andrew's was on student debt as indenture, right? What was yours on, George? Do you remember? It's similar.
On student debt.
And after that, Andrew showed up. Maybe it was a week later or so, wearing his suit. I remember that clearly. To 60 Wall and started the Occupy student debt campaign with a bunch of us. And that was sort of the way in, because we were part of the education, actually the Empowerment and Education Working Group. And so we had started with this idea of, focusing on student debt really as a sort of like a critical juncture in what was driving the economy. Like, where would people be able to collectivize? Where did they share a common identity? Where people could actually refuse to pay their student debt. And what's interesting, and this is in the book, is that the campaign ended, let's say, and we decided that we needed 1 million people to come together to withhold $27 billion from the system. And we came up with that number because 27,000 was the average amount that a student was in debt, and we figured 1 million times 27, and withhold that money from the system. And we decided to launch, I guess you could now say a petition almost, but it was a pledge of refusal. So we asked people to pledge that if 999,999 others signed this pledge, that no one would pay anymore. And we had these internal conversations that were about, could we get to 1 million? Is 1 million too many? But there's so many, student debtors out there, and no one can pay. There were, at the time, 5 million debtors, or student debtors already in default. And a year later, we had approximately 4,000 people who signed our pledge, something like that, and 1 million more student debtors went into default. And we all thought, well, if only, we're going to default anyway. At least just sign the pledge, so then we can,
What's wrong?
And so, we tried to think about, why is it that didn't happen? And so, the book that Andrew's written, which is an excellent book that everyone should read, really summarizes different areas of debt, and actually adds to, I think, a lot of the thinking that we were doing around student debt and housing debt, adds a really important category of climate debt as well, which we maybe didn't focus on as much as we could have. And also proposes these arguments that we've been talking about, and this sort of framing. So here we are, and I don't know, it's maybe 1.5 years later, 2.5 years later, it seemed like 1.5 years. And, the efforts to ignite or initiate a debtors movement have not been successful. The student debt campaign, just hasn't really materialized, and in terms of collectivizing around broader categories of debt, students and mortgage debt or credit card debt, all these things, there's not really real solidarity. And so the question that came to mind for me when I was reading this book is the same question I think that we've been grappling with for 2.5 years, which is what would it take? Why hasn't it happened? And maybe how do we need to think this such that it could happen? I think that one of the key lessons that I think that I would say we've learned is how uneven the terrain of debt really actually is. And Sarah points this out because, one of the things, we were all coming from this educational standpoint and thinking about it from, the student debtor largely. But that wasn't without knowledge or understanding that there were many other categories of debtors. It was just simply because that's how we sort of came together in this moment. And I think that, as Sarah points out, there's this very real it's debt as this larger issue, but then debt in its very clear specificities. And it's very difficult, I think, to build solidarity across those lines in the ways that we've tried to do that so far, at least. For one thing, I think that we need to really think clearly about the way that debt is framed right now. And debt is something that is really, it's framed around time. And so our framing around debt is always about time, you know? It's about, we went into debt at this point in the past, and then in the future, maybe someday, we'll pay our student loan. And so there's this very clear, like, sort of framing that happens around debt and time, and we've accepted that framing, the way that corporations and the 1% and the banks have told us to think about debt and think about it in relationship to the time in our lives. But that's not the only understanding of time. And this really becomes incredibly clear in the chapter that Andrew's written on climate debt, where the key conflict around why can't we do anything about climate change. We all, not all, but most reasonable people know that this is happening. You know, we've seen Hurricane Sandy here in New York, and we've read about big hurricanes before and all the different things. We know that we've had an awful lot of snow, and it's 60 degrees in DC. So we kind of like get this, and we want to, as people, general, like the 99% per se, we want to do something about it. But where is the conflict that doesn't allow this to happen? And it's about how do you frame the amount of time that people have been using up our environmental resources, that corporations and countries have used up those resources. And Andrew makes a point in this chapter that China, for example, and I think I have this right, uses a lot more resources today than we use in terms of manufacturing and pollution and all of this. Yet we still would owe China a debt when we look at the whole history of industrial development, right? And so their position is, well, we're not going to reduce our emissions because you guys have advantaged from this, and you have all of the privilege here, And so I think that what Sarah points to in her remarks just now about the work that she does is really significant to how we might need to really think about debt and think about time and think about our communities that are based in time and history, and how those communities are not necessarily the same, because there's a long history to how people ended up in these racially segregated areas, and why it is that they are extremely vulnerable to something that George really talks about, which is debt as a form of enclosure, okay? And debt as a way of clearing out space. And what's happening in these communities is that huge corporations are coming in and they're buying all the property. Laura Gottsteiner, who many people here know, has written an article recently, it's in Mother Jones actually, about how major corporations have come into areas, specifically in the part that I'm thinking of. It was an area of Los Angeles, which is Hispanic mostly, and how the real estate market started to soar in this area, and it was only because corporations went in and they were buying foreclosed properties, and their plan is to turn them around as rentals, but not just to rent them, but also to securitize those rentals. So, so these communities of history and communities of memory really do present a lot of problems. And when we talk about, how can we build a movement around debt, one of the key problems I think that we face is how do we actually, we all understand what our, debt is, whether it's student debt, which is, I have a lot of student debt. I mean, I've been to school like way too much.
How much?
And,
what? Student debt?
It's like $150,000, I think. Yeah. So I have a lot of student debt. When I say a lot, that's a lot.
If you can't say it, how will anybody else?
True. Good point.
Yeah. No, I owe a shitload. So, but anyway, aside from that, now I've forgotten what I was going to say. But that's the thing about debt, right? It's like, oh my God, you know what I mean? It's looming over me and I can't even think. But I mean, in terms of building a movement, you know, because I do know, I mean, like my identification with debt is as a student. Like I got, you know, Columbia was like the scene of the crime, and like I go from there, you know, and so, but we identify with our individual forms of debt very deeply, as we've seen, and you know, but we need to be able to figure out how to actually cross these different lines, because one of the parts of our thinking around Occupy Student Debt Campaign was, well, you know, students have like no like what's going to happen if everyone defaults on their student debt, right? Well, guess what? They can come after you until, you know, you are in retirement, or what you thought might have been retirement, at least, and still pursue you and take away part, at least, of your Social Security and part of whatever little resources you have to, you know, survive on, you know, like my vision is like cat food. And so we thought, well, it would be so much stronger to be able to unite with people who had more power. I mean, you know, imagine if all the people with credit cards said, you know, I'm not going to pay. You know, can't pay, won't pay was one of our slogans. You know, and along with the students, and sort of offered some kind of protection. But we weren't really able, truthfully, to build across those lines. And part of the reason for that, I do believe, is that pretty much all the aspects of debt are truly racialized. And we have very different historical understandings of where to frame history starting from, you know. And if you talk to different people, you're going to find that, you know, for some people they might want to start in 1934 with the Housing Act, which Andrew talks about in the book, and move forward from there, where people were deprived of the ability to purchase property, right, and therefore don't have the resources to send their children to college, and don't have the wealth built up to, you know, as a buffer against anything that might happen, you know. So when you start from that kind of point, you know, Sarah's question is very deep about what is your entry point, you know. Is your entry point really the issue of students? And if it is, you know, what's interesting here is that it's not really true that student debt is a white issue, which it's been framed as. 81% of African American students actually have student debt, and it's way more than the amount of debt that white students have. That's just a simple fact. And a huge amount of that issue and how you frame it is going to be related to where do you start history from. You know, and this is the exact same conflict that we have, that Andrew points out in his book, you know, in terms of climate change and sort of this, the negotiations around the climate. In the book, Andrew proposes a solution that he's proposed in another book, which I think was a book about labor and about changes to labor. Nice work if you can get it. And he proposes, I don't know, but you reframe basic income around climate change and how this dispute could be really resolved. And the way that you do that is you say that if the debtor countries, of which we would be one, provided basic income to the, you know, the owed countries, then we could perhaps resolve the dispute. And I think that we might need to look to building a different form of solidarity if we really want to have a debtor movement. And that solidarity is going to have to understand who is truly in debt, who owes who, which is a theme in the book. Who actually is truly morally indebted to the other. And until we do that, I think that it will be really difficult for you know, a predominantly white group of activists to understand their relationship to the work that Sarah does in terms of whole communities, I think you said in Queens, not far from here, being just cleared out, or what's happening in Detroit, or even Atlanta, or any of these places. And I think that that would require something that's different than the way that we understand ourselves as debtors, right? I think that we would have to look to what is a different understanding of debt and frame it around indebtedness. Because when we use the language of indebtedness, we're not talking about indebtedness to creditors. We're talking about to each other. And I think that that would probably go a very long way to starting to reframe, to create a shared framing that Sarah also mentioned in her remarks around a shared narrative, which is what we really do truly lack. You know, it's different to say, well, you know, I'm this, you know, the young generation, I just got out of college and the future has been, you know, foreclosed. And that's very different of a feeling than and an understanding of history than someone who's living in Detroit right now who has been through, you know, equity theft, or the 50% of black homeowners in this country who have either been foreclosed or will be foreclosed before the foreclosure crisis ends, or what that means, which is really that in terms of, you know, African Americans at least, the full loss of any economic gain subsequent to civil rights, and what that actually means as an individual, as a person walking down the street, and how that might feel for you to understand that any progress that you may have thought was being made was taken away, and also that no one really cares very much about that. And so that I have just a final point, which is that, sorry, I promised that I wasn't going to continue to talk and I was going to be really short. But the last thing I want to say is that I think that we're really asked at this moment to Grace Lee Boggs, a few of us had an opportunity to sit down and talk with her directly in a very small group. And she posed to us, really challenged us with the question of like what time it is, what time is it on the clock of the world? And if we really think about the crisis moment that we're in, I think that it's possible to see that the creditocracy is a symptom of this inability for human beings to really come together and understand our shared conditions, rather than the creator necessarily of it. So thank you.
Four kind of critiques of the book, which is very good. You should definitely all read, but there will be some spoilers, so be ready for that. The first is I'm curious, and this has been answered a little bit by the panel, why the focus on debt as opposed to inequality. I mean, as Pam brought up, you know, it's been really hard to organize on debt, though the numbers are there. It's been about 2.5 years, and it seems hard. Where, you know, I in no way want to over-exaggerate anything, but inequality seems to have gotten a little bit more hooks in the public discussion, the 1%, the taxes, and so on. And I'm curious, because with inequality, I think you can do, and I struggle with this question a lot, about how much is debt the actual political issue. Because with inequality, you can do a lot of work. You can certainly bring up the issues of citizenship that are very relevant and form a very powerful moral argument in the book. But you can also perhaps strip out some of the debt shame. And when we think of inequality, we can think of the economy as a much more constructed thing, where debt is very visceral and personal, and it's the promises you've made. And even though it is no less constructed, it's a little bit, the morality is very real here, as many people brought up. The second is, I'm curious, you know, Andrew anticipated this way early, so, but I'm still going to bring it up. I'm questioning how much we should think of. A lot of the book argues that there is a deep solidarity among the creditor class. Of course, the title is Creditocracy, and it's largely one project. And as such, we need a solidarity project among debtors to match that kind of thing. And I think there's definitely truth to that. But today, for instance, Walmart is possibly going to consider endorsing a higher minimum wage. They have a very huge amount of political power. It is likely they'll do that because they are losing a lot of money right now because of essentially the payroll tax expiration cut last year. Essentially, all of their customers have no money anymore since early 2013, and they're very upfront about this if you look at their statements. And so they want better wages for at least some people, not necessarily their workers, but crucially, that's a strategy that is different than we want people to be perpetually missing payments and very precarious. If you look at things like student debt, I mean, you can see some groups like realtors and doctors and other groups, are starting to be a little bit more vocal about student debt. And those aren't superheroes. They aren't the elite, but on the other hand, they're very powerful at local and state levels, in which a lot of the student, how much higher education is affordable is going to be a function of. So I question that a little bit. And then the flip side is how much is that we should view the debtor class as kind of one fundamental issue, or one issue that kind of hangs together. Because they are different slivers of it, right? We can think of things like the high cost of being poor in this country, and the kind of precarity, and the way credit cards and payday lending become a form of social insurance that is very high cost and very wealth extracting. Where on the other hand, if you're really thinking about like the aggregate debt numbers, the kinds Andrew referenced, you're really talking about mortgage debt. I mean, that's the real, if you're just looking at the big headline number. And, I can easily see us, or at least many of us, coming to an agreement that, health care and education should be decommodified and held in commons and be available to all. It's not clear to me that that's the solution for housing. I see housing activism going on in San Francisco that's gotten very active, anti-gentrification elsewhere. And there, is public housing the future? I mean, I honestly don't know. And it's not clear to me the debt framework will necessarily get us where we want to go with that. I'm going to detract a little bit from the panel here. The book really brings together an environmental framework, which I think is fascinating, and I think it's obviously very urgent. But it's not clear to me that we should want a no growth, or that the case about growth and the case about debt, the case about growth and the case about GDP is in some ways tangential to the case about debt. There's obviously a powerful metaphoric case for global debts and whatnot, but we're talking about the actual wealth extraction of poor people and people being thrown out of their homes, a very real, visceral level of debt. And I think a powerful argument is to say, if we actually took the debt collectors and yanked their foot off the throat of the economy, we would actually grow much faster. It would be a richer and more stable country as well. We wouldn't have these crazy bubbles. We wouldn't have these crazy deep recessions where no one can work. I understand you don't want to make a purist defense of the status quo in 2006, but it's not clear to me that just trying to organize on debt is a problem enough, that you're really problematizing by bringing in a whole other thing. And then the last, one thing is that when we're talking about debt and we're also talking about money, the stuff here is very much focused on specific goods, as it rightfully should be. So education, healthcare, basic survival, housing. Why do we need to go into so much debt to get these things? But I'm also equally interested in the high-level picture about where does money come from and how do we put it out there and what does it do? Should we engage in things like financial repression? He brings up the quote, Andrew brings up the quote from Keynes about the death of the rentier class. And should we be focused on a general policy that's designed to really focus on the idea that people who have savings, people who are the creditocracy, should essentially earn very little income? There's ways to do that, but that's a whole conversation that was always a little missing and still missing at this point, that I think we need to start engaging in, because those fights are being handled right now about what the future of the Federal Reserve, what the future of monetary policy, what the future of how banking works outside the exploitative contract breaking part of it. And it's one that I worry about a lot, and I would like to see a lot more discussion on. And with that, I think I hit the time. So.
Quick questions to start, and then I'll pass over to the panel. I'll pass over to Andrew first to see if he has any responses to anything the panelists have said as well. Okay, we've got one here, and another one. All right, and we have one at the front here. Okay.
I feel great responsibility, since there's only 3 of us, to say maybe what's on everybody's mind. There was a lot of talk about student debt. And I think the bottom dads is they don't think of themselves that way. I mean, their idea of solidarity is, not much beyond supporting the University of Michigan football team. So they don't live in those neighborhoods that you're talking about that are lacking deep jobs. I mean, you mentioned that a lot of African American students have a lot of debt, so that's a point well taken. But the white middle class, at least ones, are not moving into those neighborhoods. They are actually, the big trend is they're living with their parents. And the education also that they just got into debt to pay for basically alienated them from their own self-interest. In fact, Michael Hudson was commenting the other day that economic history is basically no longer even taught or even required for an economics degree. And they don't get the basic principle of supply and demand, or society as a whole doesn't get it, because if you throw money and student loans, which is money from the college's point of view, at higher education, that just raises tuition. It's inflationary. So, all these calls for more money for higher education, where's the limit? I'm sorry to be a dour-faced sort of conservative on that, but the second point I wanted to make was that what I found missing from this conversation until you brought up the Walmart thing was that businesses are, we talk about consumer debt and people with underwater mortgages, but what about businesses? There's sort of a legitimate capitalist class in this country, and they own small businesses, and they employ people, and they invest, and they have customers who have jobs that pay them. And if their customers can't pay them, if their customers have to go into debt to buy things from them, they're obviously going to suffer for that. It's really bad for business, and this whole debt thing has been sold to us as, you just put credit out in the economy and it creates jobs. Well, businesses also borrow money, and they're also hurting. So, and this I would say includes landlords.
Okay,
and
if you could ask a question, because we haven't got much time.
And just to comment on some of the things that I've said, that real estate is key. And I love that Pam said about companies in China owning big chunks of real estate. And the fact that your landlord can't borrow money to expand his operation means that some big company in China is going to be your landlord. So, that's going to be a huge problem. So just put it out there that spark anything. The students and the businesses.
If we take all the questions and then we can
mix
it up. So if you want to go next?
Well, why not the businesses?
We're taking questions from 3 people, and then we'll have some answers.
All right, great.
I'll agree. So I'd like to return to the question of principal finance. No one likes being in debt. I also agree. I've got 6 debt right now, and but much scarier is the prospect of being denied a loan when you desperately need one. So long as ordinary people need or even just want adequate homes to go to university, to access startup capital for their small businesses, as long as these things are cost prohibitive for most people, presumably there will be a very real need for lending institutions. People in this room will need to access the services offered by lending institutions. So what might an ethical lending institution look like? Have there been any history that we could maybe learn from? Or are there now ones existing somewhere that I have?
I'm so overwhelmed by the scope and depth of the panel. And I could answer such a mundane, practical question about organizing. As soon as I was so excited when I heard about the million refusing of student loans. And then I started thinking, wait, even if you refuse your student loan, as you said, you're paying your student loan out of your Social Security someday. They're taking it. Since so much of the student, what Andrew said about the government becoming the debt collector for that class, as soon as you think of student debt, you say, yes, refuse student debt, let's do it all together. March on Washington, debt march. And then you think, wait, The banks that are getting 7 and 8%, also it is on riskless debt because almost all of it is covered by the government. So when you refuse your student loan, and this government, instead of pressuring the government, you're just giving them another debt. I mean, wow, how do you get around that the government is going to pick up that debt? Which is, I mean, what Andrew said is so profound, that the government is necessarily alienated from its people. Even right now, there's some vicious Fannie Mae debt collection going on. I mean, so your government is doing that. How can you turn to your government for what you do? And also, how can you morally plan to reject that debt when the loan will never fall, or it seems like it will not? Let's put it this way: how will we make it fall on the people who made those loans, those predatory loans? And I use the term predatory not to mean usurious, but to mean if you're planning to make money on the interest, no matter how high that interest is, that's an old-fashioned loan. You're going to get the loan paid off. If you're lending money that can't be paid back, you will eventually take the collateral, and people will pay loans and fees and so forth. I call that predatory lending. I'm not sure what the official definition is.
There's so much that's come up.
I know, wow.
We could talk about this for hours, but just to start with Barbara, I'm reminded of the fact that government's role in predatory debt collection is considerable, especially in the student and education sector. $51 billion for last year was the estimate for the profits that the federal government will take from the student loan program. And when that estimate came out, people really did, they scratched their heads. This concept of government profiting from student loans to the tune of $51 billion is a real mindfuck. And especially if you consider that the money, that those profits are not being plowed back into education. They're being used to pay down the federal deficit. So they're basically being used to subsidize militarism, all the cost of the wars, the wars of adventurism in the last 10 or 15 years, and the Wall Street bailouts. And that's a further irony there. So eventually when we're talking about fighting back against predatory creditors and lenders, we have to ultimately train our eye on the role of the federal government. There's no question. Principal finance is a very good question, and I also think there's such a thing as principled debt service. People often say, well, debt refusal, does that mean we refuse all debt? No, of course not. The whole point of having moral and legal arguments and criteria for investigating the morality of debt is that you're able then to be in a position of saying, yes, these are debts that should be honored. They generated some social benefit, whether for myself or for communities that I belong to. And these are debts, on the other hand, that are illegitimate and should not be honored. And this is a distinction that that's been very active within the Jubilee South movement. And there's an instrument for a citizen's instrument for determining the difference between these two, which is called the Citizen's Debt Audit. And it's been a very interesting tool that's been adopted within the movement, most recently in Ecuador. And the president of Ecuador commissioned a citizen's debt audit, and they examined the country's external debts and recommended that a certain portion of them be repudiated. It was a very old and venerable tradition of debt repudiation on the part of sovereign nations, and that's a recent example. They said, look, yes, we do owe these debts, they should be honored, but these should not. So that's the other side of principled finance. There are responsibilities. I think we shouldn't refuse all debt. Principled finance, however, is future principled finance. To me, at least, this is our argument I develop in the book. Is a mixed economy of public and commons, and it involves public banking. But it also involves mutualist enterprises like mutual credit unions. And why should we have to choose between these? There are a lot of people in the debt resistance movement, and certainly in Occupy, who have a certain distaste for the state and for public action, which I don't necessarily share myself, because I do think there's a role for the public, for state provision and public action. And I think, for example, let's say a workers' cooperative startup is looking for financing. If it's locally, they would look to a mutual credit union. But if they have branches in different parts of the state, or supply chains in different parts of the state, then maybe a public bank that is state-owned would be the way to go. So ideally, in the mixed economy that I'm imagining, the public and the commons become more conversant with each other, and the one cedes to the other under any given circumstance, depending which can generate more democracy. Democracy not to be confused with efficiency. In that respect. I'm going to try and stop, but I just wanted to respond briefly to some of the issues that Mike in particular raised. I don't see why we should have to choose. And I want to emphasize that the focus on debt and the focus on debt resistance and building a movement is not the only thing we're doing. It's fundamentally connected to inequality. It's fundamentally connected to continued racial stratification. It's fundamentally connected to a lot of different things in our society. It's not the only thing we do. If I think of all the campaigns that I'm working on at this moment in time, the debt resistance is only one of them. And so it's not a single univocal focus, I think, but it should be a very powerful part of our work, I believe. I just wrote down some of your... Again, I think with respect to what Sarah mentioned, what do you do when you are confronted with suffering, with the urgent need to alleviate suffering? Again, I would say, why do we have to choose between these things? We respond in ways that we think are appropriate, but we also, at least in the debt resistance movement, we choose debt because we're looking for a proof of concept debt refusal. Not a mass debt strike at this point in time, because I think we learned with the Occupy student debt campaign that that's much more difficult to pull off. And we tried that campaign because we wanted to use some of the viral energy of Occupy to see if it would carry on its own, because we had no resources to run a national campaign.
Can I just clarify something?
Yeah.
So I wasn't talking about like in the cosmic sense, I meant organizationally for us,
Right.
that's been a sort of confusing point of where we put our resources and are we being responsive and what it looks like. It
Right.
wasn't in the bigger
Right.
sense, it was more thinking
Yeah.
about it, reading your book, that we've been confronted with some of those contradictions and such. Because
But
I agree with you, there's no choice. I mean, it's,
And I think the way you put it is important, where you decide to put your resources and your time and your energy. So we're in agreement. Others should respond.
I was just going to, actually, first I wanted to comment on Mike's question about specifically inequality versus debt. And I mean, it's a great question. And I remember the moment, as I described before, when Occupy Student Debt Campaign emerged, and there seemed to be this possibility. It wasn't really exactly about only student debt in a sense. Like, I think that we understood that student debt was sort of at a critical juncture. I've said this a lot, at a critical juncture of this entire system. And I think that we understood what we were doing as finding a source where people had real economic power. And at that moment, our diagnosis of the problem was that in order to challenge the out-of-control capitalism, whether you were all the way on the scale of anti-capitalist to, the system needs some kind of, socialism to be present within it, let's say, I think that we understood that debt was probably the only place where we had actual economic power. Because labor had already, I mean, we don't really have economic power there. We're on Facebook all the time making money, you know, for Facebook. And, you know what I mean? And we're doing these other forms of labor. So from my perspective at least, you know, what I understood that we were attempting, particularly once we evolved into strike debt, was really to unravel a broken system and use our economic power to do that. So it wasn't a question about inequality. The question of inequality, I think, was a subsequent question to once after we take down the system that is pretty bad, and after we stop, you know, the crisis and stop, and by in a way creating a new one, that inequality question comes up in the lack, I would say, self-critically, our lack of vision for what that new society could actually look like. And because we didn't really have, I think, the depth of analysis to include the ways in which the terrain is, you know, the debt is one broad thing, but the ways in which the terrain's rocky and how that operates and why that operates and who that operates on. Because we lacked that, I don't think that we were really able to formulate a unified vision that we all agreed on. And then just really quickly to your point about the solidarity among creditors, I think that was an interest. I actually didn't read Andrew's book as presenting it quite that way. And I think that one way to look at it is that it's not just simply, you know, all these guys get together and they talk about it and they figure out what to do, but that we are in a system that's generating, you know, what, you know, sociologist Saskia Sassen would refer to as like assemblages of power, and that those assemblages work dynamically. And so to come back to this point of why we chose debt, or my thinking, at least in my recollection of this, it was because that was where we actually possessed some kind of real power that was not symbolic. Because, you know, there's symbolism, and that's great to people marching and carrying signs and doing all of that, but it doesn't really necessarily strike at the heart of, you know, of this capitalist system that we're all sort of, you know, regulated by. And so my understanding of what we were doing was more that we were trying to break down that regulation to really, you know, open up some space potentially for new creative ways, and also that we were incomplete.
So can I, because Mike brought up Walmart, and I love to talk about Walmart. Because as soon as I heard that Walmart wanted to support the minimum wage, I'm like, well, of course Walmart wants to support the minimum wage, because A, Walmart is in trouble right now. Walmart is getting hammered in the public. Walmart is about to get smacked by the NLRB. Walmart's workers are going on strike all over the place. And by the way, Walmart's losing money for the first time in probably ever, because Walmart's driven wages down so low in this country, it helped drive wages down so low in this country, that the average person can't friggin' afford to shop at Walmart. So it makes perfect sense that Walmart's going to do that, the same way that Walmart loves public services and recommends for all of its workers to go sign up for Medicaid and sign up for food stamps, because that's how Walmart survives. But so, I mean, Walmart is also really happy to take your credit card, right? Walmart is really happy for you to come in and buy up everything on your Visa card. Anyway, one thing that is completely different and unrelated to Walmart, other than the way that these companies are, you know, basically owe us a debt, if we want to think about it that way, because we're subsidizing their existence, we didn't talk really about municipal debt at all in this panel, and that is a huge thing that comes up in the book and that comes up in the work that I'm doing a lot, in which, for example, I wrote a story a few months ago about a labor union local of public service employees in Oregon that decided to include in their collective bargaining demands the demand that the city sue the banks for, among other things, LIBOR rigging. You want to talk about solidarity among the rentier class. Rigging international interest rates is, you know, that was a definite example of an actual debt cabal. But so they didn't actually succeed in getting this through. They did get a pretty sweet deal in terms of one of the best contracts that public service employees in this country have gotten in quite a while. But they made this a central issue in their campaign. They said this is the city's debt. We are refusing the city's debt. We are going to say that this city does not owe you this money because you are rigging this interest rate, and therefore the loans that we took out with you, these interest rate swaps that we got from you, are actually illegitimate. So that was one interesting example of debt refusal happening on a collective scale as a union's collective bargaining tactic. And this was, God, I forget the number of public service workers. It's the major public service workers local in Oregon. So this was workers at the university. These were pretty much everybody but teachers. Anyway, so that's one example of what partly a debt refusal movement that could be also a labor movement look like.
All right, I reckon we've got time for like 2 more really quick questions. One over there, one over here.
Very much looking forward to reading the book, Andrew, and it's also great to see the kind of band a little bit back. I wanted to bring up something that it was a subject during Occupy Student Debt Campaign to an extent, but I feel like I've thought about it more recently. In particular, bankruptcy. It's something that I'm not sure to what extent it's talked about in the book, but it hasn't been mentioned at all today. But in particular, as it applies to student loan debt, there was a law passed in 1998 and then one in 2005. The former made federal student loans non-dischargeable, and the latter private student loans. So in particular, at least one sort of very real, concrete kind of cause that I think we can continue to rally behind is overturning that. It was referred to, I looked actually at some of the legal documents around it. It was referred to as the most comprehensive revision of the bankruptcy laws in 25 years. So I'm very much interested in that as a practical thing, and I thought maybe if I just bring it up every now and then at things like this, sort of be a little more interested in. The other thing is, I was thinking, as you know, the thought always occurs to me, and this was something that I was thinking of a lot during Occupy Student Debt Campaign, was how, in a certain sense, I just keep thinking about the idea of debt and activism around debt as, in a way, a certain response to a particular type of symptom. And in particular, the way in which, you know, it's, I think, a theme that everyone has sort of alluded to throughout this evening, how debt, in a certain sense, is to make up for basic human necessities that are financialized, you know, and the main things, housing, education, and healthcare. And I feel like in a certain sense, you know, like, you know, the murky waters of a kind of ethical lending situation, I think, are apparent. Sort of how does that work? And I'm very curious to hear how that is explained in the book, Andrew. But then also, isn't it sort of, I mean, not that anyone's suggesting anything otherwise, but the necessity to create public, universal, publicly available goods and services like housing, healthcare, and education.
Okay, and one more question over there.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't expect that last question. Apologies. I might be a bit of a change in pace. Actually, well, first, thanks to Pamela for like people said before, there's so much to think and talk about and what everyone got into. Never mind even what's come up in the comments and questions, I guess. So just to explain where I'm coming from with this question, I walked in this panel like knowing it was called the case for debt refusal, already being fine with that, and I guess depending on how you want to define that, already engaged, certainly not paying my student loans, so however you want to frame that. So from that perspective, my question is basically, one thing that seems like a main challenge in, I guess, building a movement around debt refusal or that in my thinking about it is doing the support work. So people go into debt to be able to get things like food, healthcare, housing, knowledge, skills, whatever. So to me, the support work question is, what kind of things should we be doing to help people get these things without the use of debt? So I was wondering if people had, anyone on the panel, or really anyone on the panel, had practical advice about doing those kinds of things. So to be blunt, like not just framing it around what's the best way to frame this argument, but if you have a bunch of people not paying debt and starting to then be hounded by people wanting to pay debt, what kind of things do we do? How do we support each other so that we don't start paying debt, but we do help people get the resources they need? And I say that without trying to actually get an answer. My understanding is, one, plenty of people already do that, because how do people without money or deeply in debt live every day? They must be doing something, right? And two, I think there's like useful historical examples of that too. But hope that wasn't too long.
No, it's very good.
What you're envisaging in a way is, I guess, what Sarah, to extend Sarah's analogy with the labor movement. When people go out and strike, the labor movement, there's a strike support network, there's a strike fund, and obviously there's a natural corollary there. And there's a lot of mutual aid networks that have to be set up to support those who are in the front line. And that's why, in many ways, I mean, the thinking now, I think, in the movement is of a more limited proof of concept debt strike rather than a mass debt strike, precisely because of the need for that kind of support, and also just the practical challenge of pulling something like that off. That would require resources, obviously. In relation to the bankruptcy question, student loan justice, Alan, what's his name, Alan? Sorry?
Alan Corinne.
Alan Corinne is laser focused on that issue, had been for the last several years, and will tell you, quite honestly, that he's gotten nowhere. He's had a lot of access to Congress, as it were, and there are a lot of groups that have spent a lot of money and energy and time lobbying Congress and have gotten absolutely nowhere. That's not to say these are futile efforts, but again, it's a question of where you put your resources. Quite frankly, the federal government's response to the student loan crisis has been completely appalling. It's a very cruel and inhumane spectator sport at the best of times to watch Congress do its work, but run student debt, it should be abolished as a spectator sport. They tried to do, yeah, it's the first Hunger Games. But just to, the last thing, you talked about publicly available goods. We had on the education front, we have an analysis of how cheap it would actually be to provide for the federal government to provide tuition at all 2- and 4-year schools. And if you strip away, and Mike has done work on this too, if you strip away all of the current long list of tax exemptions and subsidies that are associated with student loans, if you took all of these away, you would only need an additional, estimates vary, but our estimate was $11.4 billion a year in funding to cover the tuition. I mean, that's how little it would cost to actually have a free public higher education system in this country, and join the long list of industrialized countries around the world that do that. So publicly available goods, very important, very cheap, and doable. The obstacles are political, obviously, and the analysis, I think, in Creditocracy hopefully will go some way to helping to explain some of those political obstacles.
Anyone else on the panel want to say anything? All right, maybe one more question. I haven't taken one from over here yet. So.
It's a lot of pressure.
So much pressure.
Yeah, just I mean, very short question. How do you politicize default?
How you politicize default?
Default.
Right, like the people who didn't just sign the pledge before they went on default anyway. Be a great question. If we'd figured out the answer to that, we wouldn't still be sitting here. We'd have a movement by now.
Well, that's what you tried to do.
Right?
That's exactly what you tried to do.
Since people are defaulting anyway.
Right.
Wasn't that like the invisible army of the, yeah, the invisible army, remember that?
Well, it's weird
Yeah.
to tie it to the bankruptcy question. I mean, we have a lot of conversations about like what happens when things go well in the economy, and you have like the kind of Randian version where like I made everything, and then you have the kind of the left version says you didn't build that. And there's not actually a conversation about when things don't go well, and like how is that blame assigned. I mean, it's all done. It's done through real things. Like the bankruptcy code, you can print it out and touch it, and it determines a lot about how the ultimate defaults work. I mean, it's hard to politicize default because it's just
Personal.
It's personal.
Well,
It's not the same kind of power as a strike. And this was a big conversation I remember from the time. But when you strike, the boss is really mad because you shut down something. Where if you miss a credit card payment, the credit card company is actually kind of happy, right? Or at least in many cases, they're less.
But if 10,000 people miss a credit card payment, that makes a big difference.
Well,
Maybe
yeah,
they
but
Deliberately.
they do all the time.
Maybe.
That's all the problem.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, the real question was like, you can't just miss one payment. You can't just miss a few payments because they're funded for quite a while. So eventually, if they, if they're just adding to you to what you owe when you default, or if your student loan goes into collections and then suddenly your 15,000 turns into 35,000, turns into 60,000, you just owe them more. So like if your debt strike doesn't win, you are just making your life a whole lot worse in a way that like if you lose your job because you strike, it doesn't have the same impact. So it's really, really hard. And yeah, also we do have to find a way to make it visible, which is why I like to start out these conversations by saying like, hi, I have debt. Make it visible, make people, and the thing that I've noticed in 2.5 years of doing these panels, I think the first one we ever did was before Occupy, is that people are more and more willing to say that. People are more and more willing to say, I have debt, this is a problem. So that's what I can offer.
I mean, also you organize the defaulters. Like just a few blocks from here is the Brooklyn Housing Court. Anybody can walk in there and you can meet 1,000 rent defaulters in a day by just sitting in the lobby of the New York City Housing Court. I've done it. Right? You talk to people. You get them to explain their situation, why they haven't been able to pay the rent, why they're behind on their mortgage, why they have a money judgment against them. All these things. And if you can start there and you can begin to organize them, then you can politicize default.
Yeah, I'd be curious if Sarah, maybe you have some experience on this.
We have to wrap up right now, but we're going to go to 61 Local around the corner, and we can carry on the conversation there over beer. Bergen Street. Oh. It's on Bergen Street. And also the book is available to buy for $15 over there, and you should all get one on your way out.
We take one.
Yeah, thanks.